He is the Vice President of Student Development and Enrollment Management at Hostas. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes, Hostos Community College, yes.
Hostas Community College. And I looked it up and it said it was in the Bronx. Are there other locations?
Well, it's a part of the City University of New York. And
Okay.
CUNY is made up of 25 separate institutions across New York City.
Okay. So are you located where
In the South Bronx. Yes.
Okay, so South Bronx was correct. Okay, sounds good. Well, the floor is now yours, sir.
Okay, well, thank you. And it was excellent hearing about the grant writing process. I work at a community college, so supported from community college. Hostos just received $15 million from the Mackenzie Scott Foundation. And that money will be utilized to help with retention efforts. So Ms. Rector, who I call Auntie called me up and let me just say hey to the good Reverend Rector. I see you down there in the box. When Auntie call you, you got to pick up the phone. So let me just tell you this, a few things about myself. I have now 6 degrees. It's a degree in accounting, management. I have a double master's degree, MBA, MIS. I have a Ph.D. in educational leadership management and policy. And I just finished a diversity, equity, and inclusion certificate program from Rowan University. So I tell you all that really not to try to impress you, but simply education has been the foundation to help my family move from poverty up the social mobility index. So let me say that a little bit clearer for you. So to move from below the poverty line into the middle class, not just for myself, but for within one generation being the first to go to college, my entire family now has moved up the socioeconomic ladder because of access to education. So what I'm gonna quickly talk to you a little bit about is my research, my PhD research, but I want to just give a quick segue to part of what I heard in listening to some of the programming which you've done is that my connection through my connection, a way to be able to move in education was predicated on the foundation of me being attached to the church when I was a youngster. So I look at myself now, I give a speech, I call myself the bow tie guy now. So typically if you see me, I have a bow tie on and I walk around but when I give a speech to young people, I give a speech and I first connect with them by simply saying, I am the product of a widowed single mother whose husband was murdered when she was 27, 28 years old and had 3 children. I went to Lincoln High School, which is a public high school that was rated in a city called Flunk City in 1989. And I'm from Jersey City, that at one point was ranked one of the worst cities in the country. So that's when I meet a student who comes from a place where I come from, that's how I start the conversation. But then I quickly pivot and I tell them that I don't want to connect with you simply through a tribal lens. And I start to talk about education. Because if I don't connect the bow tie guy with my past, what I'm doing is I'm cutting off the opportunity for that young person to see themselves in me. Because when I was that young person growing up in the city, growing up in poverty, if I saw the bow tie guy, I didn't respect the bow tie guy. And the reason why is because I thought that person was judging me. Yes, I look a little rugged around the edge. And yes, the good Reverend could definitely tell you some stories about them Yates boys when we were young. But what I needed for someone to do was to look beyond the rough exterior and see that pain, see that trauma, and not have those judging eyes. So my connection when I talk about the church is, when I moved from Spartanburg, South Carolina to Jersey City, what helped me through those very trying times was the fact that I had a core value and moral fiber in me through my time in the church. So although I went away from the church for some time, that core value was always in me. So one of the things I would propose before I go into my research is, as we talk as church leaders and members, for us to remember, for some of us, where we come from and how we got to where we are now, and show the bridge between how to get there, what are the steps. It's okay to falter. It's okay not to be perfect. And we're going to meet you where you are. Because if we don't do that, I will tell you now, the young Latoro Yates is not trying to hear you. The young Latoro Yates is going to be mad when I see you. I'm going to have an attitude when I see you. And I'm going to, well, I wouldn't be disrespectful. Auntie didn't want to have that, but I would definitely, it would be a challenge to deal with. And I was the good kid. So I think that get lost sometimes for us because there's so many olden traditions that we're connected to that we sometimes forget about how we were when we were at certain stages. So I wanted to add that part in. So let me jump into my research. So the key to my research was simply this. I have made my ministry or my passion. I want to help young people make slightly better decisions that I did when I was their age. So I'm gonna say it again, slightly better decisions. But what I realized when I started working in admissions was that I would meet this aspiring junior in high school, and I would meet them at the college fair, talk to the young person. It could be from Watts or South Central or Cleveland, Akron, or Dade County in Miami. It's the same story over and over and over. I meet this young person. I want to be a doctor. They tell me about their life. They tell me they are some very sharp, very succinct, have an understanding about this presentation, unbelievable. But then the next year I would receive their academic transcript. So what I was viewing from their transcript versus the presentation did not match. So it was a disconnect somewhere. So I wanted to try to figure out what is that disconnect for African-American students when they start high school. African-American students in a high school with equal to higher aspirations to go to college as their white or Asian peers. But by the time African-Americans leave high school, they have lower aspirations than their white or Asian peers to go to college. So I was very curious about it. And that's what the precipice for my study. So as I mentioned to you, I'm from Jersey City, raised by Sadie, went to Lincoln High School. So I call this part of my presentation Dreams Deferred, because simply what happens is students are making decisions at a very young age before many of them, including myself, should have been making these types of decisions. So in essence, what happens is I'm speaking from an urban black experience. Typically what happens is some of us growing up in that experience, we bump up against the system. And the system could be schools. The system can be the doctor. The system can be police, fire department, what have you. And a lot of time that disconnect is based off of fear, it's based off of frustration, and it's based off of, in many cases, a breakdown in vernacular. In higher education, we do a poor job of explaining very basic things. For example, what is a bursar, right? Or what if the verification process in financial aid, which is very simple, but it sounds terrible to me. It sounds scary to me. So a lot of times there's discouragement for us to engage with the system, and we just bump up against it. And many of us just throw our hands up and keep moving. But in essence, what happens is in the 8th grade, some students start to make the decisions that can hurt or impact them 5 years later down the line. Let me give you an example. In the 8th grade, if I said that I want to become a doctor, and in the 9th grade, I take a biology class and get a C, I may never get access into a top tier competitive pre-med program having a C on my transcript. Now, most students going into high school have no idea about how rigorous and what's the audit, if you will, of their academic transcript to help them move to some of these places. So when students start to now realize that to become a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer or a nurse, there's certain things or certain grades that they're going to need. So in essence, many of them don't have messed that standard up before they even get a chance. And then let alone if they're taking honors, AP, and IB, those are programs within the high school. What I found in my research that students that take those courses have a higher percentage chance of going to college than their peers that are not taking those classes. But again, that goes back to families bucking up against the system. Because if a parent does not know to fight for their child to get into the honors program, AB, AP, and IB courses, international baccalaureate courses, then their child is going to miss out simply from a lack of knowledge about that process. So then I think about, well, what are some academic interventions that can happen in elementary school? I call it filling the gap. So just a quick pivot. One thing that Sadie, my mother, did that I truly appreciate was that my mother knew that she had to work to provide, so she didn't have the ability to fill in some of the gaps. So when it came to going to an after-school program, when it came to report card night, when it came to certain functions, going to the Little League football games, those types of things, she could not do that. But what she trusted in was the community to be able to do those things. So that's our auntie and I, that's our connection, because my god brothers, the Smiths, and that family helped to, in essence, raise me. But my mother was unique with that, because many of us will not do that. Many of us will not trust upon another family in any kind of capacity, because we may be embarrassed by it. We may be shunned because we're a single parent and cannot participate in certain things. So I say thank God for the ability for some families to step in and fill those gaps. That's what the Smith family, the Rector family, that's what they've done for us, even in all these years. And I'm 50 now, so they still doing it for me. But some of the things that these interventions are addressing mental health. So I just mentioned that my mother Sadie did some amazing things, but one thing that she did not do, but I don't blame her for that, is she did not address the trauma that we received. That was 15 months when my father was murdered. She did not address that with a 9-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 15-month-year-old. So there's so many of our youth that have these traumatic experiences that are not addressed by resources. So then we wonder when they hit 14, 15, and 16 years old, and they're proverbially released on the world, why so many of us falter. Food and housing insecurity. If you go to the Smith's house in Spartanburg, South Carolina, there's always a tin of some biscuits that are on the oven. I tell you, that family fed almost all of Pineview Hills. But it's being able to provide for a family, helping with food. And we always had a house full of food in my house. But what I didn't have was that family sitting around a table holding hands and praying before they eat. Or Miss Smith saying, go wash your hands, Vittorio, before you go. Those are skills that I talk to and use with people to this day. So that's the piece. And so but understanding that there are young people who cannot learn. Research is pretty steep in the research about learning ability when a student doesn't have a full stomach or nutrition in the morning before they start school. I talked about addressing learning gaps, tutoring, peer mentorship, but doing that at a very young age before they get old enough to be embarrassed about those deficits. And then there's something that's called NAEP scores. So here's some research for you. A student in the 3rd or 4th grade who take the national NAEP score exam, if that student is in the bottom 25th percentile in the 4th grade, there's a 75% chance that that student will stay in the bottom 25th percentile by the time they're in the 8th grade. And if they're in the bottom 25th percentile by the time they're in the 8th grade, going into high school, that lower their chance of graduating high school by over 50%. So if you've ever heard that the prison pipeline, and based on how many prisons to build, is 3rd grade test scores, that's where that information is coming from. There's an author called Prudence Carter. She wrote a book called Keeping It Real. In this book, she introduced this term that's called a multicultural navigator. So a multicultural navigator is a person who have a belief in, a reference for a given community, and they serve as a bridge. And they're a bridge between the student, the parent, and the community, and what I mentioned earlier, the system. A multicultural navigator can be a coach, a guidance counselor, a principal, a local doctor, pastor, teachers, but it's someone that can step in because and help with that language that I talked about, that vernacular that I talked about. Because we have some parents that are reluctant to engage with their teacher or school. Some of it is because they had a bad experience, some of them, with a teacher in their younger days. So some of them are reluctant. I mentioned some parents work and cannot go to a report card night. And some parents honestly spend more time preparing their child to fight against being marginalized in society versus worrying about how good they do in class. And then when it comes to students going off to college, some families are just not comfortable sharing their financial information with people that they don't know. Again, the FAFSA, the federal financial aid process, can be very scary because they're asking a lot of intruding questions. So let me tell you a little bit about my findings and I'll wrap up. Early exposure to careers and college readiness should start in elementary and middle school. African-American students who attend IB programs at this high school where I studied had equal or higher chance of graduating attending college as their white and Asian peers. Multicultural navigators play a pivotal role in mentoring students and working with their parents to understand the importance of allowing their children into these honors and IB courses. And then also working with administrators to be able to create times where parents can come to the school that work around their schedule, understanding that some of them have schedules that just is not conducive to the regular time where they have what they call a parent teacher night. So let me give you a part of my charge today to you. My charge is that we have to understand how society perceives us. And I'm saying us as people of color, Black people, African Americans, how society perceive us. So my study was in a town in South Jersey that's not too far from Delaware, actually. It's a little rural city, has about 5,000 residents. So in this city with 5,000 residents, you have 4 small towns that are farm towns that are about 1,500 people in each one of them. So through elementary school, the white students go to a school, Black students go to a school. But in high school, they mix. So when we were doing I was a part of a research team and we were asking questions of parents and residents in these 2 different towns. What we started to see that the academic output of the city and rural students in the gifted and talented programs were equal going into high school. But then we noticed that when they hit the high school, white and rural students, they went to predominantly the IB track, whereas the African-American students went into what's called the college prep track. And there was a difference in the academic rigor of those 2 tracks. And of course, the outcomes were that the white students had a higher percentage that went off to college. But it wasn't simply because the white students were smarter, it was simply because of the access. So here's the interesting part. Some of the perceptions of white families and students in these small enclaves, when describing people of color, Black people actually, in this what I call South City. Some of the perceptions were they didn't care about school. All they did was do drugs and get pregnant. Crime and murder is a major part of their lives. They are all gangbangers and baby mothers. Now, I was blown away by this perception of black students in this small town, rural town, because they were being compared to large urban environments from Camden to Trenton to Newark to Jersey City, where I'm from. So I was curious. I took a look at the amount of murders over a 5-year period in this area. Over a 5-year period, it was 4 murders in this town. Where I'm from, that's a slow Saturday morning when it comes to the type of violence that's happening. So the key takeaway is that we are thought of in the same way, whether we live in a little small rural town We live in a large urban town. So it's real when we feel like we walk up against that wall, or we bump into that wall, or we are fighting against the system, and we feel that when we call the system is real, that perception of us is real. So here's the challenge. How do we prepare our young people when they're going off into the world and they're running up against those perceptions? So that's how I can circle this back as I end to say, see yourself as those multicultural navigators. When you have young people that are in your church, that are part of your programs, now it's an opportunity for us to be able to give them that armor when they walk out of your presence. And that armor is, we have to really, again, approach them where they are. This generation of young people that we deal with today, many of them, and I just turned 50 in February, but I realized 20 years ago that I had, even probably further back than that, that I'd already reached the age where I couldn't impact the group I wanted to get to. I wanted to get to the 12, the 13, the 14, the 15-year-olds. So they look at me as the old bow tie dude. I get it. So what I try to do is make sure I'm always reaching down to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation, so that I can speak to them in their language. Sometimes that may not be as palatable because I come from an older Black tradition in church. And many things I grew up in that tradition, and the way that a lot of life students perceive themselves and their identities, it's a clash with some of the things that I grew up in the church. So the key is, how do we find a mechanism to be able to allow them to be their identity, but give them the parameters of how, or that shield that they need, which is that moral fiber to be able to move in life. So I give lectures, I speak at churches, I speak at pretty much anywhere someone will give me a microphone. But it's really about trying to help young people feel unjudged, give them a safe space, give them an opportunity to speak. I try to listen more than I'm speaking. And I don't agree with a lot of it, to be very frank with you. But I agree with them having the ability to express themselves and trying to figure out, how can I get them to fall in love with education the way I did. If you'd have told me that I would have a PhD, I wouldn't have laughed, actually, because when I was 17 years old, I met Dr. Robert Perry at my high school exit day graduation. And this Black man was visible. I couldn't articulate that at 17, but when he walked into a school full of white people, they were at attention when this man walked into the school. So all I could do at 17 is attach that to becoming a doctor. So at 17 years old, I said, I'm gonna become a doctor. I didn't know how hard it was to become a doctor, the different types of doctors. I didn't know any of that. I just knew I wanted to become a doctor. So if that inspiration fueled me in that way, I hope to be able to try to do that for others. Auntie, I could go on all night, so I'm gonna stop there.